Committees are a bipartisan institution in an increasingly partisan Congress. They are a place where members can come together on a regular basis for committee work, for hearings, and as such, they have a potential for relationship building. As the Congressman mentioned, many members don't live in DC. They're only in DC a few days a week, and they don't have a lot of opportunities to build relationships. Many of them did live in DC a few decades ago. And so committees can be this space. In the book, I tell the story of the famous friendship between Dick Lugar and Barack Obama. Dick Lugar, a longtime Republican senator who passed away in 2019, two-time chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I interviewed him for the book before he passed away, and he credited his friendship, his famous friendship with Barack Obama, with their joint membership on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and their shared experiences on that committee and the trips that they took together on that committee. Of course, that's one example of a very famous friendship, but I think it speaks to the capacity of committees as a space for relationship building, and committees can lean into that. We can create more bipartisan working spaces for staff, more bipartisan briefings. The Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which started in 2019, did things a little differently. It had staggered seating in committees. That might seem like a mundane detail, but normally committee hearings have one party sitting on one side of the room and the other party on the other side of the room. And the Select Committee decided to do things differently and have staggered seating. So when you turn to the person next to you, that might be someone from a different party. That's not to say that that's going to solve all the problems, but committees can lean into their capacity, at least, their potential to be that space for bipartisan cooperation.
I'd like to go back to the congressman and say, does that ring true with you? Do relationships matter? And if they do, how are they created? Where are they created? And how could we foster even more of them?
There's kind of two areas where you can become effective, or you can build the ability to be effective at legislation. One is go on TV, be really angry, and scare everybody. Marjorie Taylor Greene is that example, right? She's the de facto leader of the GOP right now because everybody's scared to death to oppose her. And the other is in that relationship building. How do you get those relationships built? As was mentioned, 20, 30 years ago, most members of the House, at least, lived in D.C. We don't get a living allowance. I guess that might have changed this year, which is good. We didn't get a living allowance. We had a salary of $174,000 a year, which to the average American sounds like a ton until you put together the fact that you have to pay to live in D.C. and you also have to maintain a residence back home. So now you're talking half of your salary going just to maintain those places to live. You can't even write that off on taxes, by the way. There's a special line in the tax codes that says you can write off living expenses for work unless you're a member of Congress, in which case you cannot. We're the only people. And so, you know, on top of that, so it doesn't make sense to get an apartment for many people. So they live in their office and they shower in the gym in the morning. A significant number live in their office. But on top of that, if you're not home for a weekend or you live in DC, you're now attacked by your opponent for going Washington because you're never home. You've turned into Washington. And so what is the limited ways to build those relationships? Number one, the gym, okay? We have a gym that was pulled out of the 1970s directly, but it's a really big gym, and we have a half Olympic swimming pool. And so what happens when you go to the gym is, you know, everybody's in a different environment. You may play a game together, basketball, racquetball. I just lifted weights and ran, which is kind of a solo sport, but in that process, you get to know people outside of that environment of legislating. And there's kind of an unspoken rule at the gym of you can talk about some things, but don't you dare try to debate in the gym or you're going to be like frozen out of ever going. And so that was a way to build kind of those relationships. The best way that I noticed, though, in building relationships is travel. People give, again, you get a lot of guff for traveling. And some of the trips that we could take certainly deserve it. If you end up going to Paris and whatever, you know, I can understand how people would be upset. But many of the trips go to Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine now, right? And it's a real opportunity to get to know somebody at a personal level. And that's what we're missing a lot of. Relationships play an essential role in being effective.
Some great questions here. I want to start with one. There were a few about transparency, and I want to put our panel on notice. I want each of you to answer this, but maybe keep it short since we're running short on time. The question that I have is it always at odds with, is transparency, I should say, always at odds with bipartisanship when there could be a public cost to being seen as being bipartisan and reaching across the aisle? And I'm going to start here so you can think about this. When I was in Congress working for Senator Murray, we took two big swings at budget deals. One through the super committee, which failed epically and disastrously, and one with Congressman Ryan, then later Speaker Ryan, where we basically went behind closed doors and were able to cut a deal. The super committee had a ton of attention on it. The deal with Ryan had almost no attention on it, and that was by design. We actually found in that case that cloaking the conversation led to an easier pathway to bipartisanship, technically outside the committee structure, but in a way it ran counter to what I think a lot of people would think, that transparency and sunlight is always positive for lawmaking. So that's where I come from on this question, but I'm interested in where all of you do. I'm going to start with you.
Oh, sure. Again, looking at the history of Congress, I'll take a historical perspective yet again. Cameras were introduced into Congress relatively recently in the 1980s. And in the early days of cameras in Congress, folks like Newt Gingrich were known for making speeches to an empty chamber because he knew that someone on TV was watching and that person wouldn't know that the chamber was empty, that he could use camera presence to mobilize public support or opposition to an issue. And indeed, as I mentioned, committees are important as a public space for members to signal to the public what they're thinking about an issue. And transparency is critically important to our democracy. It's important, as I mentioned, for us to have access to understand what's going on in Congress. And yet, there is a real danger here. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is what I call theatrical hearings. These are the hearings that we're most familiar with because they're the hearings that we see on TV. The hearings that everyone is there staging a show. But one of the things that the folks that I interviewed told me was that, of course, there's no use putting on a show if there's no one watching. And so it's those spaces actually when there are, those hearings where they're not going to get as many kind of cameras there, as much media attention, where there can be real openness to learning, to deliberation, to a lot of the kind of positive elements of hearings. And I'll give an example of kind of the opposite of a theatrical hearing, of what an educational hearing might look like. This was 2015. Genetic engineering is new on the scene, and the House Science Committee held a hearing about genetic engineering. There was no bill on the floor kind of next week. It was not a particularly fraught or contentious issue or one that the media was particularly interested in. At the time, it was very new. And I use it as a case study in the book of a hearing where members just came to learn. They came to learn from witnesses. And so that still happens, but it is indeed, as you're saying, those hearings that are not the ones that get the most media attention, that there might still be space to learn. So I think it's a nuanced issue. We need to be balancing that need for transparency with this realization of the real impact of media attention.
I'll keep mine very brief, so we can get through as many of these as possible. So follow up with me if you want me to go into more. The bottom line is we have to strike a balance between, yes, transparency, but also recognize that transparency leads to showmanship. It's a fact. The other thing, this is just a personal deal. We have created, members of Congress are actually really good at messaging now, because anytime you walk anywhere, these guys come up to us and are always like, Congressman, what's your view on this and this and this? That's actually a good thing. I think that's good. The problem is it can program people to answer things in sound bites.
Yeah, I think it depends. This past week, I spent a lot of time looking at gift disclosures, which I'm sure Mike and you two love, which it's where a senator House office has to disclose like a trip or something. Politico had a really good scoop about that earlier this week. That's good. That is good when we know where these members of Congress are going, what sort of retreats they're going on, who is paying for that. But there is, in this day and age, a freak out during high attention floor votes or committee assignments when, I don't know, AOC is talking to Marjorie Taylor Greene. That doesn't happen. But like two members of opposing parties, there's an immediate freak out. Oftentimes there's actual lip reading of what goes on. And, there is a point where we need members of Congress to actually just not feel that pressure. It's pretty weird for me to say as a reporter, because I want to know everything you guys are saying. And my industry right now, what's en vogue is being able to report what's behind the scenes. But that wariness, I think, also creates a sort of inability to strike deals. But you guys should just keep telling me everything.
I'll say quickly too, it leads to a loss of trust. We had a thing in the kind of the mid 2000s, like 2014, 15, when we were in the majority as Republicans. We would not talk honestly with each other in our conference meetings because it would always leak. There's always somebody that's like live streaming everything we say, so it does lead to a real loss of trust. I'm for transparency, but we have to understand that there is a balance.